It can be rather frustrating to know that God is present, but not know what God is saying. How often have you and I pleaded in prayer, God, I'm scared. I'm not sure what to do. What am I supposed to do? Just tell me. I can say that for me, it's an almost daily prayer from my heart. Our prayers tend to revolve around the need for concrete answers to those things that cause us concern. We tend to have a need for tangible expressions of what God would have us do. We tend to have a need for guidance to alleviate our concerns. Or more accurately, we tend to have a need to tell God what we would like to have happen. Even though we ask for God's guidance at times, in our hectic world, it can seem like an impossibility to hear what God's voice is saying to us. The psalmist offers that sometimes we just need to be still and listen. Be still and know that God is. Carl Rogers, the great American psychologist, taught active listening, a practice of repeating back or paraphrasing what you think you are hearing and gently seeking clarification when the meaning is not clear. The psalmist, I think, is suggesting going even deeper, seeking a peace that can only be experienced in the stillness of a moment with the Holy One. Be still and know that I am God. It's all about listening. Here's a story for you. In one of his memoirs, President Franklin D. Roosevelt told of a time when he'd gotten tired of that big smile of his and saying the usual things at all those White House receptions. So one evening, he decided to find out whether anybody was paying attention to what he was saying. As each person came up to him with an extended hand, he flashed that big smile and said, I murdered my grandmother this morning. People would automatically respond with comments such as, oh, how lovely, or just continue with your great work. Nobody listened to what he was saying, except one foreign diplomat. When the president said, I murdered my grandmother this morning, the diplomat responded softly, I'm sure she had it coming to her. There are those times when we are so busy, so involved with our own thoughts, our own words, our own needs, times when we are so busy trying to impress that we fail to listen. And I would suggest that we fail to listen to God more than to anyone else. The psalmist in Psalm 46 is singing the praises of God and how we have no need to fear. Nice words. But the reality is we do fear. The reality is we can become so caught up in our fears, so caught up in making sure that God is aware of our fears, that we can't hear God's reality, that fear does not need to control us or have any power over our lives. I would suggest that there are times when our prayers become reflex rather than reflection. Times when our prayers are forced out of our fears rather than blossoming out of our faith. Perhaps, just perhaps, those are the times when we should reread verse 10 of the 46th Psalm. Quite powerfully and quite clearly, God is quoted as saying, "Be still and know that I am God." Be still and know I am God. It's as if God is saying enough already. It's time to trust with your whole being that I truly am the refuge, the strength, the ever-present help that you keep talking about. It's time to stop the chatter and begin the trust. It's time to trust that God's promises are real and can provide a solid foundation for us to build healthy lives on. There's a story told about a weary traveler in the early days of our country who came to the banks of the Mississippi for the first time. It was a time when getting from here to there was accomplished by walking or by horses. There was no wide 4-lane concrete interstate bridge crossing the river. In fact, there was no bridge at all. It was early winter, and the surface of the mighty stream was covered with ice. But should he dare cross the river? Should he dare cross over? Would the uncertain ice bear his weight? Night was falling, and it was imperative that he reach the other side. Finally, after all sorts of hesitation and many fears, he began to creep cautiously across the surface of the ice on his hands and knees. He thought he might distribute his weight as much as possible and keep the ice from breaking underneath him. About halfway over, he heard the sound of singing behind him. Out of the dusk, there came a man driving a horse-drawn load of coal across the ice and singing merrily as he went his way. Here he was on his hands and knees, trembling because he was fearful the ice would not be strong enough to hold him up. And there, as if whisked away by the winter's wind, went the man. His horse, his sleigh, his load of coal, upheld by the very same ice on which he was creeping. I would suggest that, like the weary traveler, some of us have learned only to creep upon the promises of God. Cautiously, timidly, trembling, we venture forth upon God's assurances as if the lightness of our step might make them more secure. The psalmist reminds us that God is our refuge and strength, an ever-present help in trouble. The psalmist reminds us that the Lord Almighty is with us. We don't need to be timid as we approach life because God has promised to be with us. I think another way to describe what the psalmist is offering is the idea of confidence as we find described in the tradition of meditation. Sakyong Minphon Rinpoche writes in Running with the Mind of Meditation. In Tibetan, confidence is known as saji. This word can also be translated as brilliance or to shine. Through the mind of meditation, we develop saji or confidence when we have confidence in the spaciousness of our being. Discursive thoughts and emotions are not as problematic because our view has grown bigger. With this view of basic goodness and the confidence that arises from it, whatever we encounter seems workable. I maintain that we will lose confidence. We will lose trust. We will lose our sensation of sacred presence. We will lose our feeling of refuge. We will lose our sense of strength if we don't take time to pause in the midst of the pressure, to remember and experience the simple fact that God is. Be still and know that I am God. Be still and know that I am God. It is when we enter the stillness, when we dwell in the depth of the moment, that we can truly begin to hear what God is saying. So what is God saying to you as an individual? I don't know. But the fact is, God has promised to be with you. Be still and know God. Is God telling you to pursue a particular vocation? I don't know. But the fact is, God has promised to uphold you no matter how thin the ice you might be on is. Is the spiritual path you're on the right one? I don't know. But the fact is, God has promised you victory over all of your spiritual enemies. And above all, God has accepted you, promising full and free forgiveness for all sins, self-imposed and other imposed. I read somewhere that there are some 8,000 promises in the Bible. God, through the voices of the prophets and the voices of the disciples and the voice of Jesus, made 6,000 of them. Those promises hold for each of us today. God doesn't make them for us to creep upon as if they were too fragile to hold us up. We can stand with confidence upon the promises of God. Be still and know that God is. Then is when you will hear God guiding you forward. Just a thought.